Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event, Supporting Mental Health and Well-Being of STEM Graduate Students, Highlights from the National Academies Report. This webinar is hosted by the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology and was co-organized by ASBMB in conjunction with the American Chemical Society, American Geophysical Union, American Physical Society, American Society for Cell Biology, and Professional Development Hub. My name is Kirsten Block, and I am ASBMB's Director of Education, Professional Development, and Outreach. The ASBMB is a nonprofit scientific and educational organization with over 11,000 members worldwide. Founded in 1906, the Society is based in Rockville, Maryland, and publishes the Journal of Biological Chemistry, Molecular and Cellular Proteomics, and the Journal of Lipid Research. Before I introduce the moderator for this event, I'd like to cover some housekeeping notes. First, if you have difficulty connecting to the audio through your computer, you can connect via phone at the number listed in your registration confirmation. Please note, whether you connect via phone or computer, all attendees will be muted for the duration of the webinar. To ask a question, please use the Q&A feature, which you may access from the control panel at the bottom of your screen. Questions may be asked anonymously if you feel more comfortable doing so, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible, including those submitted in your registration. With that, please let me introduce our moderator for today, Layne Scherer. Layne is the Senior Program Officer for the Board of Higher Education and Workforce, and she joined the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in 2016. There, she has served as the lead and responsible study officer for the following three projects: graduate STEM education for the 21st century, pre-service education, professional development, and the workplace for the teacher education workforce, and mental health, substance use, and well-being in higher education. She has also served as the deputy to the director of the Roundtable on Systemic Change in undergraduate STEM education. Prior to joining the National Academies, she was a science assistant at the National Science Foundation with the Office of the Assistant Director for Education and Human Resources, and served as an executive secretary under the National Science and Technology Council's Committee on STEM Education. She earned her Master's of Public Policy from the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, where she also earned her BA with concentrations in English literature and the history of art. Layne, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give a brief overview of the report before introducing the panelists, Julie Posselt and Frances Leslie. So we are going to take a look at these here. All right. So supporting the mental health and well-being of STEM graduate students. We are all excited, and a special thanks from the National Academies to the hosts for this and to the collaborators. We're really excited to get a chance to speak with all of these groups at once. And so the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine had the opportunity to put this report together with support from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Institute for Drug Abuse, and the National Institute on Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse. But I think the more important question is, why did the National Academies decide to address the mental health and well-being of students? Looking at a 2018-2019 Healthy Mind survey, which covers both undergraduate and graduate students, 40% of students reported experiencing significant mental health issues. Major depression has increased since 2007, over doubling. Students reported severe anxiety, again, almost doubling in the rate between 2007 and the 2018-2019 year. Eating disorders also changing. A very concerning increase of reports of suicidal ideation as well. And suicide attempts had increased, again, almost double. While 2% might not seem like a very large percent, if we think about the number of students that represents, that is almost certainly more than any of us would want to see represented in these figures here. And so this collection of data are just some of the points that the National Academies took into consideration when thinking about this report. It's not just the data. There's been a lot of so-called ink spilled on mental health and well-being of students, a lot of write-ups in national press, concerns from groups like the JED Foundation, the Steve Fund, and others in terms of what is happening at this particular moment in time that affects mental health, substance use, and the well-being of students. And it was originally called out in a report on graduate STEM education for the 21st century that came out in 2018 that really identified mental health as a significant issue for graduate education to be thinking about. So in terms of the report, so the report itself was developed over the course of about 18 months. Both Dr. Posselt and Dr. Leslie served on the committee. And with the support from our federal sponsors, we really looked across a wide span of issues. So we looked from community colleges all the way through graduate school, including medical programs. And we looked at the recent research, we looked at the data, rates of diagnoses, programs, and other support mechanisms for students, what sort of environmental issues. So, what is the culture and climate at a college or university like that can really support mental health and well-being? And we came forward with 10 recommendations that fell into 5 themes. So one is thinking about the institutional culture and the policy. So what does it mean for leadership to really step forward and say that this is a critical issue that needs to be addressed? How do the policies around student leave, around accommodations for the Americans with Disabilities Act, how do those come into play for students? How well are they communicated? And do students really know what they have the right to pursue while they're in a higher education setting? Prioritizing mental health amid financial constraints. So one of the things that we were thinking about in terms of the immense pressure that colleges and universities are facing, state institutions are receiving less and less money, both from the state and from federal sources. Tuition is continuing to go up while sort of the demands on campuses are going up as well. So there's also sort of the tension between how much can tuition continue to go up versus how much can colleges and universities provide. But the committee really thought that it is critical to prioritize mental health despite the constraints that universities might be under. Understanding the state of student mental health and well-being on each campus. Well, I provided you with some larger numbers from a survey, the Healthy Minds, from the Healthy Minds Network that covers about 300 different schools. It's really important for each college and university to have a snapshot of what's happening on each campus at their, right with the students that they're working with. For example, there might be, we looked at some of the states that have recently had legislation around the legalization or decriminalization of marijuana. They're going to have different issues than states that haven't. And so really understanding, the status in the issues that each campus is facing will help each administration target what support mechanisms are needed. Capacity to provide needed services. One of the things that the report really wanted to highlight is that this can't all be on a counseling services, rates of things that they need to solve. The institution needs to be thinking about a cohesive suite of support systems from well-being, so sort of non-clinical supports. How are they supporting faculty? How are they supporting and providing information to families who have questions about how their students' health is being affected and what supports are available? All the way up through how are universities and colleges partnering with external, so with community support providers. As we all know, the health system in the US is not easy to manage or easy to navigate. And so the greater degree that colleges and universities can provide help and support to students who are seeking support off campus for their mental health, the better the students can navigate those resources. And finally, developing faculty, staff, and student capability to be of help. And so this is really thinking about how do the people who are really at the front lines, either working with students or working with other students, be supportive in terms of being able to recognize distress, being able to follow up with the students who might be, appearing to have signals that they are in a difficult situation, and being able to refer them as possible. And so one of the big things that I think will be of question today are, how much does this report focus on graduate students? What are the key takeaways from the report itself? And so just to let you know, the report contains some information that's specific to graduate and medical students, but it has a broader focus mostly on undergraduates. The recommendations, of course, to the college and university leadership, those are bigger recommendations that really can impact all students at a college or university. Some of the needs, and I'm sure all of you who are on this webinar are aware, the needs of graduate students are quite different. They're at a different stage in life. The academic concerns are different. And so providing support mechanisms and providing other resources for graduate students that are specific to their needs can be incredibly important. And overall, one of the reasons that the report doesn't focus as much on graduate students or medical students is the research that's available and the data focus more on undergraduate students. And so, we will be sharing some more information in particular to graduate students, but one of the things that came out of this report was a research agenda to the federal agencies in terms of support that they could have for making more resources available to the field, and more research on graduate education was something that the committee really thought was important. And then finally, graduate students are not a monolithic group, taking into account the identities that they have. So in terms of race and ethnicity, there are sexual and gender diversity within each campus's population, first generation students, students who are undocumented. All of these are different identities that should be taken into account when thinking about graduate students, as those identities will intersect as well. And so from here, I will stop sharing and I will turn the floor over to our first panelist, Dr. Julie Posselt.
Thank you, Layne. You teed me up wonderfully. Let me just take a moment and make sure I'm all set to go here with my slides. And how does that look, Layne?
Great.
All right, great. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the chance to connect with you today around these important issues. And I'm really happy to be able to share with you some of the aspects of this report that are specific to issues that directly affect students. So obviously the study is inspired under the notion of supporting the whole student. And so from the very beginning, we've had a lot of sensitivity to what does the whole student mean, the different facets of student well-being that are implied when we use the concept of well-being, but also, as Layne pointed out, the distinctive needs that students have based on their backgrounds, based on their roles, based on their institutional context, and of course, all of the factors that are affected by life outside of being a student that have bearing on well-being as students. So with the time that I have, just 8 to 10 minutes, I'm going to try to get to 3 points. One, some of the issues that are facing today's students with a focus on the specific needs and challenges that graduate students face. Second, some of the supports that are needed that the report draws out, and I'll be highlighting 4 of the recommendations that, that Layne identified and going into a little bit greater depth with those. And then trying to go from that forest into the trees just a little bit and share with you some results that are salient to this from a research study that I recently conducted with PhD students in STEM about what faculty support means to them. And this is intended to be kind of a window into this broader issue of what does it mean to take responsibility as faculty, to take responsibility as institutions for students' well-being. And one of the threads that ran throughout our panel's discussion is how much the imperatives for well-being mirror the imperatives for equity and diversity, that they do demand systemic change. They do demand attention to culture as well as structures and incentives. So I'll try to put that thought in your mind as I'm going forward, keeping in mind also how much this report is related to other ones that the Academies has recently released around graduate STEM education for the 21st century, mentoring, as well as the recent study of sexual harassment in institutions. So some of the patterns and issues facing students are highlighted in Layne's remarks. Oh my goodness, and that looks funny to me, and I'm guessing it does to you too. What it should say is that 85% of college students today are non-traditional, which means they are outside of the bounds of the 17 to 21-year-old student age group that colleges have traditionally served. This is an issue in that more students than ever are juggling more responsibilities in the course of their college obligations. But academic programs and universities have been relatively slow to adapt to this reality, and the increasing pressure and multiple responsibilities living off campus means that students' lives are really community-based, but often our resources are centered on the institution. We know that 3.2 times more likely, graduate students are 3.2 times more likely to screen positive for depression when they frequently experience racial discrimination. So both sexual harassment and racial discrimination are significant factors in student well-being. And previous research has also identified how much discrimination is associated with anxiety for undergraduates as well. But rarely have institutions taken responsibility for managing this from a systematic perspective. We tend to focus only on individual interactions, individual bias that sometimes are manifested in interactions, but there are also systemic issues around resource distribution, the availability of same-race counselors within counseling centers that can all speak to ways that universities can more effectively serve students around the racial and gender inequities and issues of discrimination that we know are real, but that we have sort of been taking an ostrich approach toward. Research shows that 50% of students who have mental health disabilities will avoid disclosing them for fear of the stigma that might come from their teachers or their students. But this is a significant issue because we know that when students don't disclose the issues that they're facing, they're not going to get the supports that are needed that enable them to be successful. So more effort around the reduction of stigma, opening up the normalcy of mental health as an aspect of well-being, as an aspect of health writ large, we think as a group is really an important part of the cultural shift that's needed. And then lastly, of course, COVID has impacted a variety of students' well-being and in different ways. 20% in a study that was conducted last summer by Active Minds found that COVID had negatively affected their mental health. This was with a sample size of about 1,700. And of course, the issues that surround this are everything from the grief of loss of loved ones, the isolation and social disconnection that we're all experiencing, the loss of income and anxieties about the utility of this degree that they're working so hard for right now, and whether the jobs will be there on the other side. So of course, COVID has magnified disparities that have already been there. And this goes too for students who are most at risk for issues around mental health. So what are some of the supports that the report recommends? So in the first and probably most fundamental recommendation that we make is that institutional leaders should articulate the importance of creating a culture of well-being on this campus. This is something that sort of provides the foundation for the other recommendations that we make. And it's especially important as one of the recommendations that affects students specifically, because they come into the worlds that we have established. They are coming into the spaces that have been sort of normalized for us. And to the extent that we who are presently in institutions have normalized well-being as a value, both kind of in a general university sense, but also in the individual workplaces where we're located, the more likely it is that new people will be socialized into that value. Secondly, we know that sometimes pauses are needed, and the necessity of leaves of absence policies to accommodate mental health issues and for re-enrollment policies to be a part of what it means to take a leave is increasingly important. And this is both from the standpoint of substance abuse as well as mental health issues. We know that recovery is a process, just like healing is a process. Third, Layne pointed to the importance of there being a recognition that universities need their own plans. We spent a lot of time trying to establish whether there are baseline practices that everybody should be doing, or whether we really do believe in the value of individual institutional assessments. And we came down on the latter side, mostly recognizing that resources vary among institutions, specific student populations vary, and there really is no kind of cookie cutter approach that will work best for meeting a given university's population of students. And then finally, and I would bet that Francis is going to speak to this as well, the importance of professional development for everyone within institutions to begin making this part of our culture of well-being is really critical, and empowering faculty to see the difference that they can make when they have some basic knowledge about these issues, not to replace the role of a counselor, but at least to be able to spot when issues may be emerging is important. But we also made a recommendation that as part of the orientation that students receive, that they should have opportunities to learn about well-being and about what it means to contribute to a healthy, respectful climate. And then this goes back to that issue around discrimination, that if we take as a norm that we are creating a positive climate, then the discrimination that compounds risks of anxiety and depression is less likely to occur. Okay, so with the last couple of minutes, I want to provide just some really quick findings from a study that I published in 2018 called Normalizing Struggle. That was a phenomenology trying to understand the phenomenon of support as PhD students from underrepresented backgrounds understand it. The two major findings from this is that when students think about the experiences with supportive faculty that they've had, there were two main findings that what those people did. One was those faculty were able to reframe the difficulty of graduate school and specific situations so that students would be less likely to internalize the difficulty as an issue with them and recognize that it was about the situation at hand, the challenge of academic research. And then the second set of findings are around what faculty do to facilitate ongoing supportive relationships. And here it's some really basic stuff, like they make themselves visible, they're around, they are responsive to communication, that instead of kind of playing up their egos and their status, that they try to downplay those hierarchies, and that at every turn, they're trying to cultivate trust. So from this, we developed a model, basically, of what does holistic support in doctoral education look like. We know, as you can see on the right, that graduate students, especially in STEM, have a specific set of challenges that they experience. And those challenges are associated with the needs with particular forms of support. What we found is that those behaviors that students expressed as being conducive to support tended to be directly related to an academic dimension of support, a psychosocial element of support in which students felt validated, and then the sociocultural aspects of support were really about how do we keep real the dynamics of race and gender that are still salient within the academy. And instead of trying to hide the need for support on that, incorporate it into our mentoring and support for students. So in conclusion, what I would just like to close with is the idea that what faculty tend to do is humanize the mentoring relationship to the greatest extent possible. And as they begin to humanize that relationship, students learn to trust. They learn that that's valid and that it is contributing to the culture of well-being writ large. So with that, I will turn it over to Francis. I think you may still be muted.
My dog was barking, which is why I was muted. So, can everyone see the screen? So what I want to do is to share with you the institutional perspective on what we can do to support student well-being. I was graduate dean at University of California, Irvine for over 10 years before I stepped down in fall of 2019. And so what I'm going to share with you is more or less an institutional case study of what we did. So first of all, one of the important recommendations from the report was that we need to understand the state of student mental health and well-being on each campus. And so we need to conduct surveys. And that's effectively what we did. We actually did this in 2016, and we did it system-wide. So there are 10 University of California campuses. So we all worked together to create a survey and to have almost 4,000 students take the survey that included a number of questions about how they were doing, but it also included the CESD, which is a clinically validated measure of depressive symptoms. And what we wanted to do was to see what factors seem to contribute to depression. So we actually published this study. My Associate Dean, Susan Charles, is a clinical psychologist who analyzed the system-wide data. And we saw that 29% of master's students, 39% of doctoral students were at risk for clinical depression. 11% and 16% were experiencing a severe depressive episode. And then on the right, which is partially covered by our faces, but never mind, you can see the factors that contributed to depression, that correlated with depression. Financial concerns was the major negative that correlated with depression. Poor mental relationship and systematic bias, usually racial bias, those all contributed to depression. These were factors that supported students, and if they were present in the student's life, they were less likely to be depressed. And these are the correlation coefficients. Social support in general, support from the department, and most importantly, optimism about career prospects. So we then, another recommendation is that there needs to be a cross-campus coordination, collaboration, and leadership that supports a culture of well-being. And my campus, we were very concerned about the findings. Actually, although the system-wide average was 39% for doctoral student depressive symptoms, our campus was 46. So we needed to do something. So we created a task force that met for 2 years that consisted of people from all over campus, students, staff, and faculty. And we came up with a number of recommendations, but here are some of the policy initiatives that were implemented as a result. So we reviewed all graduate policies to ensure that the language in those policies supported students. We mandated that all doctoral students complete an individual development plan with their faculty annually. This was initially very controversial, but buy-in did increase. And the reason for it was to improve communication with faculty, not just about research, but also about career plans. Often students are afraid to talk to faculty about these things. We required that faculty write explicit expectations for grades and research units because a lack of clarity in this area was a major cause of stress for our students. The graduate division that I led released student satisfaction data from mandatory exit surveys broadly to all faculty. We had a lot of data that we shared with deans about what students liked and didn't like when they completed their PhDs, but that often wasn't shared with the faculty, and they were pretty surprised when they saw some of the data. We encouraged programs to implement codes of conduct, and we had already done this, but in lieu of the concern of students, the financial concerns, we implemented 5-year funding guarantee for all PhD students, and that has been taken up by some of the other UC campuses since. With regard to developing faculty, staff, and student capability to support emotional well-being and mental health, and one of the recommendations is to provide mentor training starting in graduate school for all faculty, recognizing that good mentorship practices serve as a protective factor for student mental health. So we have created a Mentoring Excellence Certificate program that is a 6-week program that covers things such as understanding strategies and techniques for effective mentoring, gaining familiarity with campus resources, developing a personalized philosophy and mentoring plan, mentoring students from diverse backgrounds, and conflict resolution. That was an area that was really important for graduate students. And hundreds of students have taken this now. They can write in their resumes that they are certified in mentoring. And I insisted that any student who was mentoring for the graduate division, we had several programs in which graduate students mentored undergraduates, that those graduate students had to take this certificate. So it's imperative to provide equitable support to students of all identities. One of the concerns that we had was that there's, as Julie mentioned, there's a lot of stigma and bias towards mental health problems. And students often don't want to go for counseling services to help them. The other problem is that counseling services have this wall of silence and can't necessarily communicate back to the academic programs what the students' issues were. So we created a graduate division counselor position, This is from a news release. He offers Zen-like experiences to students. And he is a clinically trained counselor, but he's not working as a clinician. So, so students know that on a need-to-know basis, he will share information that they have communicated with him. But he does it very rarely. But this reduces the stigma of mental health because he's not a mental health counselor. Academic departments can require students to meet this counselor, which you can't do for mental health counselors. This counselor can be accessed by students, faculty, and staff alike. The model has been very successful, has been adopted by 3 of our sister campuses. And actually, before I left, we hired a second counselor because I remember one of our students saying we should have 14 of these. They are so valuable. And from that news release, Fong is the name, Fong Long is the name of one of our counselors. He believes that the difficulties we encounter are meant to impart wisdom, and he shares this philosophy with every student he meets. Within these sessions, he also provides additional academic support, time management skills, effective communication skills, and referrals to campus community resources as needed. Many of the students who come in because of conflicts with their faculty advisors, so he helps them to manage those. Another recommendation is to provide all students with formal instruction on how to develop and maintain well-being. One of my faculty colleagues, Dr. Mahtab Jafari, created a course called Life 101, which is offered to undergraduates and graduate students alike and has been very successful to the point now that it's actually been extended to all University of California campuses. And then there were a couple of things that weren't really highlighted in this report, but have been highlighted in previous ones and were clearly important factors in protecting our graduate students from depressive symptoms. One was social support. We, a number of years ago, created a program called Decade, which was created to provide a supportive community of faculty, staff, and students that particularly for students who felt that they were underrepresented in the programs in which they were. So it provided a community, it provided resources, and it still exists to this day. It was originally federally funded and then institutionalized by our campus. And we found that our underrepresented students, before the program started, they were graduating at about 50% rate. After the program started, that went up to 68% 6-year graduation rates, and it was equivalent between underrepresented and majority students. We don't know if the program actually created this, but several students told me that they would not have finished if it had not been for this program. And finally, and very importantly, career development. So these are data taken from a recent article on the NIH BEST program. So NIH BEST is a program that was created by NIH to provide professional development and career development opportunities for graduate students and postdocs. And we were fortunate to be one of the campuses that received these funds. If you look at the top left-hand column, you'll see that for graduate students, so as graduate students on top, postdoctoral scientists on the bottom, that the majority of graduate students actually were more interested in pursuing research and industry than they were in pursuing academic careers. But the problem is that faculty often don't know anything about research and industry. They only are interested in understand academic careers. So it's really important that our campuses create professional development programs to help our students really understand what's available for them. We institutionalized this program once the NIH funding ended, and the graduate division and a number of other offices on campus offer additional support. Another concern that faculty have is that this professional development will take their students' time and attention away from their research, and that they won't be able to complete their degrees in a reasonable time. So these are data from the same paper. They looked at 3 different cohorts of students. Treatment are students who participated in the NIH BEST Career Development Program, and then a comparison of equivalent students who did not. And you can see for each of the 3 years there was no difference in the time to degree for students who actually participated in professional development, and they were significantly happy. So thank you for your time and attention. I think it's time for questions, and I have my email address for anyone who is interested in what I said but don't have an opportunity to ask a question today. Thank you.
Well, this has been great. So I think the first question I'm going to tee up is for Julie. We've heard a bit about how stigma, culture, and environment can drive poor mental health. What are things that large organizations like ASBMB and or federal agencies can do to help make changes in these areas or encourage them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a couple things that immediately come to mind, one for agencies and one for organizations. One of the kinds of leverage that societies have is a sort of bully pulpit or convening power. And so the messages that they send about what we are as a field have the potential to percolate in a way that's different than an individual organization within the society might be able to influence. So the storytelling potential of societies in their newsletters and their national meetings, who they choose to highlight and what aspects of the individual's work they want to highlight is really important. One of the interesting things that's happened in the last few years, as we've begun to have this more open conversation about mental health in academia, is there are a lot of people who have come out and said that I almost didn't make it through my graduate program. The pre-tenure years almost killed me. And those stories, I think, have the potential both to help normalize the realities of mental health as being an aspect of our health, but also to draw attention to the need for systemic change. And it's when we begin to surface the pains that people are more likely to take action on them. And so I think because societies are a little bit buffered from some of the legal consequences of work within specific labs or departments or universities, they have the potential to raise awareness and change norms in a way that's different than individual departments and individual PIs can. So in short, the storytelling aspect of it and what aspects of success and what the normal pathways look like can, I think, destigmatize mental health issues. Something that I think federal agencies can do is provide a little bit more of a buffer for the students who are funded, for the postdocs who are funded. Right now, our graduate STEM education is really driven by federal grants and fellowships. And the more that we build into the system an expectation that the mentors of those graduate students and of the postdocs should have some training, should have some skills, should have some positive outcomes as part of the review process, is something that I know is under discussion in some places. So that's more of a proactive stance as opposed to what societies can do, which is like, how do we engage the realities of mental health issues in our fields?
Thanks so much. The next, I'm going to combine a couple of questions because there were a number that came through about the Mentoring Excellence Program. So Frances, could you say a little bit more about who taught the program and how it was delivered? Other than that program, where else might faculty have gotten that training support? And can you remind folks if the mentoring certificate was meant for faculty or graduate students?
So before the pandemic, it was offered in person. It is now being offered online. It is so popular that there are two parallel tracks this quarter alone. So when I was running the program, it was team taught. I would actually give the first workshop, and it was an overview of mentoring. And then others with specific expertise would provide input into other areas such as conflict resolution, mentoring across differences, and so on and so forth. This was intended for students, not for faculty. I meant to say that time constraints stopped. That faculty are more resistant, certainly to a 6-week, it was 6 2-hour sessions. To a 6-week program. So I condensed this to a 1-hour presentation for faculty, gave it to our decade mentors. So each graduate program has a decade faculty mentor. And by the end of the hour, they said, we thought we knew everything there was to know about mentoring. These are people who are specifically identified as mentors. And they said, but we didn't. One of the things we didn't want to do was to make it mandatory, because our faculty already have a lot of mandatory training and it just becomes a checker box. We really started with a bottom-up approach where our students, we hoped, would learn enough to actually encourage their faculty to become better mentors. And obviously some of those students will go on to be future faculty. And then some of the interested faculty did ask for shortened versions of it.
And I think this is a question, it would be great to get both of your perspectives on this. One of the pressures that faculty claim and use against professional development, against leaves of absences, this could also be in terms of if students want to take time off to go do internships with industry or with policy organizations, is that grant funding to support students, that time component, is it time, Dr. Leslie, when you were talking about the BEST program, you said that there were no significant differences between those who did and didn't complete or those in the comparator group. But how, sort of what else can be done to get faculty on board without overwhelming them? What else have you seen work?
So the reason I showed the data is because faculty do respond to data. And so you can tell them anything you like, but if you don't have data to support it, then they will be skeptical, and rightly so. We in our BEST program actually chose not to do, we planned to do internships, but it does become very disruptive if a student takes, say, 3 months off to do a summer internship. Other BEST programs actually created the internships as the students were finishing their PhD, as a bridge to a postdoc or some other career. But we found that programming, 2 hours a week of programming was enough to give our students a feeling of confidence. And then our one of our other departments that also supported career development, they actually provided some free courses for our students. So my response, other than the data, is that you could see that students who felt confident in their career prospects were much less likely to be depressed. And a less depressed student is going to be a more effective student.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I have so many things to engage with you on. One is faculty, especially within STEM, often need data. And something that I've observed is often the data is not enough, that the number doesn't necessarily drive home the reality of it. And sometimes the data in combination with personal experience or exposure, vicarious experience to it, can have an added effect. So the California Endowment, when trying to persuade people of the positions that it holds, says we should have no numbers without stories and no stories without numbers. And often they work together to help build the energy that's needed for culture change. And I've seen that within STEM for sure. An element of the question around internships, I think it's related to the broader questions about what are the careers that people are going on for, and whether the conventional PhD, as we've organized it around the conduct of research that leads to a dissertation, is sufficient. So to me, the questions about how flexible should our systems be to students' needs for professional development, leaves of absences, or internships are related to the issues around for what are we preparing students. And so building in mentoring compacts and individualized development plans, I think, would be beneficial as part of the conversation around who might need a leave and for what purpose. But certainly we have set up, especially in large STEM programs, the value of cohorts, and cohorts moving through a PhD program together doesn't leave as much room for individual divergence from it without there potentially being a judgment of inferior or superior student for deviating from that group cohort norm. But there are fields, and historically doctoral education was oriented around very much individualized development. So I think programs have some grappling to do themselves with the value of the cohort and the value of the individualized path that has implications both for what their everyday work lives might need to be like in ways that encourage well-being, but also that question for when a pause from the cohort-based approach is needed in order for them to take care of their own futures.
And I'll note with that, this is specifically around transfers between the labs and between research advisors, but I would note, and I'll say it with a caveat, this is Harvard that's rolling it out and they have a lot of resources, but Harvard has recently released a fund that will cover students if they are looking to change from one lab to another. And so I think some of these creative uses of additional funding to provide both, it's the concern of the principal investigator, who might need additional funds to be in use to cover work that needs to be done in a lab, but then also for the student who might be on leave, who might need support in another dimension. I think providing that coverage and that safety net is incredibly, is something that I would imagine a lot of other schools might look to as a
It's
possible.
not just
My own
Harvard, by the way.
PhD program right now. Oh, sorry.
Okay, go ahead. Who else is doing that?
UCI is a state school, a public institution, and our School of Biological Sciences does that. It provides a quarter of fellowship support for a student who needs to transfer and can also work with the faculty and resources that they need. It's just the best use of resources. I always felt as graduate dean that if the student drops out, think of all the money that we poured into that student. So putting in, 1/4 fellowship support is small by comparison to the actual loss.
Yeah. In the last 2 years, I've taken on 2 new advisees who were part of transitions from other labs. And the way that the School of Education at USC does it is the school will cover an additional year for the PI to provide that transition for them. So yeah, I mean, I think this is what institutions are for. They have resources and capabilities that individuals do not. And in the interest of protecting investments, in the interest of protecting equity and well-being, these are good uses of funds in the long term.
Great. And there are 2 questions that are pretty closely related, and they get at both the faculty, how faculty can deal with and help address the stress that students are facing in terms of career prospects, and then also what students might do themselves. And I think since we have a great audience with the professional societies, what can be done in sort of the broader arena of professional development to help support not only the search, but also help make the search less stressful. It's not just providing the resources, but how can they be accessible and help students navigate where they might go next. And if there are resources for PIs to help either become better mentors and better advisors in this area as well.
I think now we're being so careful not to interrupt each other. You want to start this one or shall I?
We can both do it. So we found that the individual development plan was one way to really break down those barriers in which students, because we had very specific topics that we had in the plan. Other programs were allowed to change the plan if they wanted, but one was professional and career development. And it allowed students the opportunity to tell a faculty member that they did not want an academic career. And that was something they were terrified about. Not only did they communicate that, but they had to come up with a plan as to how they would prepare for their future career. And obviously it's different at each stage of the PhD, but I'm working with a student who just advanced to candidacy just now. And I'm saying, so what are your career plans? How are you going to prepare for that? So I think that it can become embedded in faculty culture to ask those questions. And I don't know how many faculty still feel disappointment when their students don't pursue academic careers, but it's a minority of biomedical students who do. So I think we have to understand that.
The last data that I saw that was STEM wide indicated that there was 1 tenure track job for every 12 PhDs in STEM that graduates. So I think data like that can help normalize diverse career pathways. I'm sure some people in the group today have heard about the AAU PhD initiative, which is trying to make visible and more valued diverse careers as well. I was personally the beneficiary of an advisor who always used the plural when talking about your career plans. She always wanted to know what my plan A was, as well as what my plan B and how they were evolving. And so I think if, especially in times of economic uncertainty and academic job market uncertainty in particular, we can normalize a multiplicity of plans and the potential that there is value in pursuing different ones. That's good mentoring in general, but it's also very healthy, I think, for students in recognizing that amongst themselves, that, your future is not contingent on a particular outcome. Your well-being, your value is not contingent on a particular outcome. As for what COVID has done specifically that I think societies can do, one of the most important things is opening up social media networks like Slack and creating opportunities for connection between industry partners that academics themselves may not know. You know, some societies within iGen that I'm a part of, the Inclusive Graduate Education Network, are thinking very explicitly about pathways from undergraduate to PhD, but more importantly, PhDs into different types of postdoctoral opportunities, building connections with national labs, building connections with industries. So again, having that convening power makes possible connection building, that students aren't as much reliant on their individual advisors network as opposed to the disciplinary network as a whole.
And at the institutional level, two things that we did that I think were probably helpful. One is to bring in alumni. So we have alumni seminar series, and students respond very much to alumni. They see themselves in the alumni, and they're very interested to hear what our alumni do. So it shares a broad perspective of career options for them, and it also expands their network because now they have new members of their network. And then the other thing I mentioned, sharing data. So in our doctoral exit survey, we asked students what their next position was. And again, I think faculty were quite surprised to learn how few students were planning to go on the academic route.
That's great. And I just wanted to highlight to everyone who's tuning in, I did just drop the link to the National Academies report on the science of effective mentorship in STEM. I know a lot of questions have circled around that. So I think it's a great resource, as well as the podcast that they released around it. One of the questions that I'm seeing sort of on the fringes of what's being discussed is we're talking about, you know, an academic environment and how it impacts students, and the way that faculty interact with students is so critically important. And there's a lot on their plate already. What can colleges and universities be doing to also support, since students so often look to their principal investigators and their advisors as models of behavior? And we can imagine if their principal investigators and the researchers are already overworked, if they have trouble, you know, balancing demands, what can colleges and universities be doing, especially for new faculty, to be addressing their well-being in all of this as well? Because they play such a central role, and if they're burned out, it makes it much harder to support the students that they're working with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the reasons that I have committed my research career to the study of graduate education is that's where we're socializing people to what the next generation of scholarship within our disciplines should be. And so I think the intervention, Layne, is both with respect to new faculty, but also what graduate schools are normalizing graduate students to as a broader frame than what the immediate world that they might be gaining exposure to within their individual lab or their individual PhD program. So recognizing that graduate schools have access to resources that is a little bit broader, I think that's potentially one way, that the norms that the graduate school communicates for what's possible post-PhD may be different and healthier than what the very real things that where individual faculty are still part of incentive structures, that even if they're good mentors, they may not be aware of all of the ways that their micro level behaviors are potentially perpetuating problematic things. Now, for new faculty, I think a big part of it is, what do our startup packages look like? And STEM, oh my goodness, your startup packages are a dream to those of us in the social sciences and the humanities. But I think some institutions are beginning to think a little bit about, in the awarding of a startup, is it assumed that it's going to be principally for equipment, for what purposes? And when it can be used to buy time so that faculty's attention is not stretched thin. That's something that some universities do and some universities don't. Another thing that I think new faculty can benefit from is community. And there are great resources like the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity that create communities of early career scholars who are not in the same program. So there's not as much of the looking left and looking right for what the normalization is. But again, kind of like what a graduate school can do for students, creating that wider sense of community. And I do think it's when we open up our own individual experiences to a broader conversation, then we can begin to think more creatively than we do when we're thinking only about comparisons with our day-to-day. So yeah, that's a sort of a second thing that faculty can sort of do for themselves, is participate in communities like that.
So I'll just very briefly talk about the NFCDD that Julie just mentioned. They have a summer program. I think it's a 10 or 12-week program for junior faculty. And the faculty that I know have taken it said it's transformed their lives. It's taught them how to manage time, how to create and establish priorities, how to have regular writing schedules, etc. You can have institutional membership of that particular center. Irvine does, and we open it to our graduate students, postdocs, and faculty. And the graduate students who have used the resources say it's very, very helpful. So it's, again, it's a financial investment, but in comparison to what you're going to lose if you lose either a student or a junior faculty member, it's worth it.
So wanting to be cognizant of time, I think I'll reserve the last couple minutes for this final question, then any last remarks that you want to give. One of the concerns that often comes up is resources, and not all universities have the access to resources that some of the biggest institutions do. What are some activities, or what are some of the lower lift changes that faculty can make to improve sort of the environment that their students are working in? And then any final comments that you'd like to have before we wrap up?
So my my first instinct on that is to think to the research that I've done that finds that when change occurs, that it's always multi-level, that there's the structural changes that require financial resources. And then there's the kind of meso-level organizational policy changes that require some investment of time. But there's a huge amount of change that can occur at the very micro level. So during the pandemic, I stopped emailing my students over the weekend. And guess what? That turns out to be really good for me too. I think there are like a host of micro level habits that we have built into our work lives on a day-to-day basis. And by starting with that, kind of starting with ourselves and starting with our own well-being and making clear, hello kitty, that we are modeling that as what's normal and what's good, that does begin to change things kind of from the inside out. And then to have those conversations with our colleagues about being purposeful around those habits, I think can make a difference. Certainly that's not going to bring about the sort of structural change that allows for people to have a leave of absence where it doesn't exist right now. But it might just make a difference in terms of your own well-being and those of the immediate circle around you. I would say that the more, as far as final comments go, the more we can tie this conversation to the conversations around power and equity and inclusion that have been circulating for a longer period of time, I think the more effective we'll be at both having the sort of rich discourse that we need about the incentives and whether the world that we've created in academia is the world that we want to pass on to the next generation. Because ultimately it is through our individual behaviors, as well as for what we advocate for within the institutions that we're a part of, that will make the difference for what the system looks like for the next generation that's coming through it.
So I agree with Julie that a lot of small things can make a huge difference. And so many of the things that we did at Irvine were with existing resources, and they didn't cost a lot. Mandating an IDP, for example, requiring that faculty actually explain to students how they're evaluating their research, et cetera, et cetera. These don't require a lot of resources. They do require institutional drive to do this. And faculty themselves may make some small changes. Some of those more policy changes have to be done as an institution. So I, as a graduate dean, worked with my academic senate, or my graduate council, to see what our faculty felt was appropriate. So everything that we did at the policy level was a collaboration between administration and faculty senate, which is very, very powerful in the University of California. Sometimes some resources are needed. When I first introduced the counselor model, our first counselor had an MSW from USC, and actually didn't earn that much. People think that it's going to cost a huge amount to bring in these additional positions. But again, you have to do a cost-benefit analysis and find the resources that you need to do what you want to do. A lot of what we did was to get federal funding. So I got 2 federal grants, education grants, while I was dean, even though I'm a scientist, to support my educational programs and my goals. And then I talked about NIH Best as well. So there are ways to get the resources that you need, both externally, but also I always encourage faculty to talk to their administrators. If they express a strong need and have a good argument, then the administrators will listen. So I would like, as final thing, to get back to, it takes a village and it takes everybody working together. When we did our task force, we had undergraduates, we had graduate students, we had faculty, we had health affairs staff, and it was a very, very good experience for everybody to be focused on the same goal, which was helping our students.
Well, thank you both so much. I'll turn it over to Kirsten to wrap us up.
Yes, thank you so much to our speakers today for facilitating such an important discussion, and thanks to all of you for attending. As you close out of the webinar, you will see a link to an evaluation form. We would greatly appreciate your feedback in the development of our future events, workshops, and webinars. As I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar was co-hosted by a number of professional and scientific societies that are dedicated to advancing the career development of graduate education workforce. And our next event, which will be hosted by the American Chemical Society on May 12th, we'll also take a look at mental health, this time with a focus on tools and resources for graduate students themselves to prioritize their own mental well-being. If you are a graduate student that you know is interested in participating on this workshop, I encourage you to be on the lookout for future communications from one of your professional societies. With that, have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and thank you all.